The stretch of highway between Millbrook and Carson City had earned its reputation the hard way. 17 miles of cracked asphalt cutting through dense pine forests, no streetlights, no gas stations, just darkness that seemed to breathe. Locals avoided it after sunset, taking the longer route through town instead, adding 20 minutes to their journey without complaint. They had their reasons, though most wouldn't speak them aloud. The road had witnessed things, collected secrets in its shadows, and on that October night, it was about to claim another story for its collection. Emma Rodriguez had been driving for 6 hours straight, her eyes burning from staring at the endless white lines, her back aching from the cheap rental car seat. She should have stopped in Millbrook, should have listened to the gas station attendant who'd given her that look when she mentioned taking the forest route. But she was running late, and the shortcut would save precious time. The clock on her dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when her headlights caught something that made her foot slam the brake pedal. A figure stood on the shoulder, arm raised, hand waving in desperate arcs. A young woman, maybe 25, her white dress practically glowing in the darkness. Emma's heart hammered as she pulled over, gravel crunching under her tires. Every instinct screamed at her to keep driving, but the woman's frantic gestures, the way she stumbled toward the car, triggered something deeper than fear, the need to help. Emma lowered her window 3 inches, just enough to speak through. The woman's face pressed close to the gap, mascara streaked down her cheeks, lips trembling. Before Emma could ask what happened, before she could offer to call for help, the woman spoke 7 words that turned Emma's blood to ice water. Now I've spent 65 years on this earth, and I've learned that the worst moments in life rarely announce themselves with thunder and lightning. They slip in quietly, wearing ordinary faces, speaking in normal voices, catching you completely unprepared. This story, the one I'm about to share with you, it stayed with me for reasons I'm still trying to understand. Before we go further, I need you to do something for me. If you're hearing this and you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, click that button now. These stories need to be told, need to be heard, and I need to know they're reaching people who understand why we tell them. And leave me a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. I want to know where these words are landing, whose ears they're finding. This particular tale, it started 3 months ago on that God-forsaken stretch of highway, but its roots go deeper, twisting back through years of poor decisions and desperate choices. Emma Rodriguez wasn't supposed to be on that road. She'd planned her route carefully, mapped every stop, every rest area. But life has a way of shredding our plans, doesn't it? A delayed meeting, a flat tire that ate up an hour, a series of small catastrophes that pushed her schedule later and later until she found herself racing against midnight, trying to reach Carson City before the rental return office closed. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, trees so thick they formed a tunnel, blocking out even the weak moonlight. Emma had turned off the radio 30 minutes earlier. The static was getting worse, and the silence felt more honest somehow, less likely to mask the sounds of engine trouble or a flat tire. She was alone out there, truly alone, and she'd made peace with that until she saw the woman in white. The woman's breathing came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the window glass between them. Her eyes, wide and glassy, fixed on Emma with an intensity that bordered on madness. The words she'd spoken hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away, impossible to ignore. Emma's hand hovered over the door lock, frozen between compassion and self-preservation. Behind the woman, the forest stood silent, watching, waiting. Nothing moved in those trees, not a branch, not a leaf. The stillness felt wrong, felt staged, as if the entire world was holding its breath to see what Emma would do next. The woman pressed harder against the window, her palm flat against the glass, fingers splayed. Her white dress was torn at the shoulder, the fabric stained with something dark that could have been mud or blood or both. Her feet were bare, scratched and bleeding, leaves stuck to her skin. She looked like she'd run through the forest, run hard and fast from something that terrified her beyond reason. Emma's rational mind catalogued these details, processed them, tried to construct a narrative that made sense. Car accident, assault, mental health crisis. Her brain offered up possibilities like cards from a deck, none of them landing quite right. The woman's lips moved again, forming words Emma couldn't hear through the glass and the hammering of her own pulse. She gestured frantically toward the tree line, toward something Emma couldn't see. The smart choice, the safe choice, would be to drive away. Call the police once she got cell service. Let trained professionals handle whatever this situation was. Emma knew this, had grown up with a father who drilled stranger danger into her consciousness until it became reflex. But there was something in the woman's eyes, something that bypassed logic and connected directly to Emma's gut. Pure, undiluted terror. Not the performed panic of someone trying to con or manipulate, but the genuine article, raw and unfiltered. Emma made her decision. She reached for the door handle, and in that moment everything changed. The woman's expression shifted, the fear melting away like wax near flame, replaced by something else entirely, something cold and calculating that didn't match the torn dress and bloody feet. She took a step back from the car, then another, her lips curving into a smile that belonged on a different face entirely. Emma's hand froze on the handle as understanding crashed over her like a wave of ice water. She'd been about to make a terrible mistake. The woman in white took another step backward, her smile widening, becoming something predatory and pleased. Emma's fingers released the door handle as if it had suddenly turned white-hot. Through the windshield, she caught movement in the trees, shadows separating from shadows, taking human form, 3 of them, maybe 4, moving with the coordinated patience of wolves. They'd been waiting there the whole time, waiting for Emma to unlock her doors, to step out of the car, to make herself vulnerable. The woman's white dress hadn't been chosen randomly. It was a beacon, a lure, designed to catch the eye of anyone driving past, to trigger that instinct to help that still lived in some people, despite decades of news reports warning them otherwise. Emma's foot found the gas pedal, but before she could press down, before she could escape this trap she'd nearly fallen into, something massive struck the rear of her car. The impact threw her forward against the steering wheel, the horn blaring into the night. Her rearview mirror showed a pickup truck, black or dark blue, impossible to tell in the darkness, its front bumper pressed against her trunk. The driver's face was hidden behind the glare of his headlights, but Emma could see his silhouette, large and still, waiting. She was boxed in. The woman in white stood directly in front of the car now, no longer pretending fear, no longer performing. Her bare feet planted in the gravel, arms crossed, head tilted to one side, as if considering what came next. The figures from the forest had emerged fully now, 4 men in dark clothing, spreading out around Emma's vehicle in a loose semicircle. None of them rushed, none of them showed any urgency. They had time, their movements said. They had all the time in the world. Emma's hands shook as she shifted into drive, her foot hovering over the gas pedal. The woman in white must have seen the intent in Emma's eyes, because she moved, but not away. She moved closer, stepping directly into the path the car would take, planting herself there with absolute confidence. She knew Emma wouldn't hit her, knew that core of humanity that had made Emma stop in the first place wouldn't let her commit violence, even to save herself. She was counting on Emma's decency, weaponizing it. The men continued their slow approach, hands visible and empty, non-threatening in their body language, as if they were simply fellow travelers who'd stopped to help with car trouble. One of them, tall with a pronounced limp, circled around toward Emma's driver's side door. Another, shorter and broader, moved to the passenger side. They were coordinated, practiced, and Emma realized with sickening certainty that she wasn't the first person they'd done this to. This highway, this dark stretch that locals avoided, had provided them with opportunities before. The truck behind her revved its engine, a low, threatening rumble, pushing her car forward by inches. Emma's vehicle groaned under the pressure, metal complaining, tires sliding in the loose gravel. The woman in white hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, her smile fixed and terrible. Emma's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She could try to ram through, but the woman stood firm, and Emma's conscience wouldn't allow it. She could try to reverse, but the truck had her pinned. She could run on foot, but the forest was their territory, and she was wearing city shoes, carrying city reflexes. Her phone sat in the cup holder, useless, showing no signal, no connection to the world that had rules and help and consequences. Out here, different laws applied, older laws, the kind that governed predators and prey. The tall man with the limp reached her door, his hand finding the handle, pulling, locked. He made a disappointed sound, tapping on the window with one knuckle, gentle, almost polite. Emma pressed herself against the far side of the car, as if those few inches of distance mattered. Her breath came too fast, hyperventilating, visions starting to tunnel. She fought to stay conscious, to stay alert, knowing that surrender to panic meant surrender to whatever these people had planned. The man tapped again, harder this time, and Emma saw his other hand held something, a tool of some kind, dark metal catching the reflection of her taillights. The woman in white finally moved, walking around toward the driver's side with measured steps, her bare feet crunching gravel, apparently immune to pain. She crouched down until her face was level with Emma's window, that horrible smile still in place, and pressed her lips close to the glass. Emma could see her clearly now, see that she was younger than Emma had first thought, maybe early 20s, with features that might have been beautiful if they weren't arranged in such a chilling expression. The woman's lips moved, forming words Emma could barely hear through the glass, but she heard enough to understand, enough to feel her stomach drop into free fall. The woman's words penetrated the glass, muffled but unmistakable, each syllable carefully enunciated so there could be no confusion about her meaning. She was explaining what would happen next, the sequence of events Emma could expect, and doing so with the casual tone someone might use to describe a recipe or give directions to the nearest town. The clinical detachment in her voice made it worse somehow, transformed the horror of the words into something surreal and nightmarish. Emma stopped breathing, stopped thinking, her entire consciousness contracting to a single point of primal fear. The tall man with the limp raised his tool, and Emma recognized it now as a window breaker, the kind kept in emergency kits to escape submerged vehicles. He positioned it against the driver's side window, taking his time, making sure Emma saw exactly what was coming. The woman in white continued speaking, her breath fogging the glass with each word, her eyes locked on Emma's with an intensity that felt somehow intimate and violating. She was enjoying this, Emma realized. Not just the violence or the control, but this specific moment of anticipation when the victim understood their situation fully but hadn't yet given up hope, still believed there might be a way out. The pickup truck behind Emma revved its engine again, louder this time, and she felt her car shudder under the force. The horn that had been blaring since the first impact finally cut out, leaving only the sound of idling engines and the woman's steady, terrible narration. Emma's hand found her phone, fingers closing around it uselessly. No signal meant no help, no cavalry coming, no last-minute rescue. She was alone with her choices, and every option seemed designed to end badly. The shorter, broader man on the passenger side produced his own tool, a pry bar, and wedged it into the doorframe, testing the seal, looking for purchase. Metal groaned. The woman in white finished whatever she'd been saying, stood up, and stepped back, giving the tall man room to work. He positioned the window breaker one final time, drew his arm back, and Emma did the only thing left to her. She closed her eyes and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The car lurched forward, tires spinning in gravel before catching, engines screaming in protest. Emma kept her eyes shut, couldn't bear to see what happened when 2 tons of metal met flesh and bone, couldn't bear to witness what survival would cost her soul. She expected impact, expected the sickening thud, expected her car to shudder as it rolled over the woman in white. None of that came. Instead, She heard laughter, high and bright, and genuinely amused. Emma's eyes snapped open to find the road ahead clear, the woman gone, vanished as if she'd never been there at all. The rearview mirror showed the pickup truck falling back, giving her space, and the men who'd been surrounding her car stood in the road, making no attempt to chase her, their forms shrinking in the distance as she accelerated. They were letting her go. That realization brought no comfort, no relief, only a deeper sense of wrongness. Predators didn't release prey without reason, didn't spend time and effort setting elaborate traps, only to open the cage at the last second. Emma's speedometer climbed past 60, 70, 80 miles per hour on a road designed for 45, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face. She'd escaped, but escape felt like the wrong word, implied victory or success or skill. She hadn't escaped. She'd been released, and she had no idea why. The speedometer touched 90 before Emma's rational mind reasserted enough control to ease off the gas. The forest blurred past, trees forming a solid wall of darkness on both sides, her headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the night. Her entire body shook, adrenaline flooding her system with nowhere to go now that the immediate threat had passed. She checked the rearview mirror obsessively every few seconds, expecting to see headlights bearing down on her, expecting the pickup truck to materialize and finish what it started. The road behind her remained empty. 5 miles passed, then 10, and Emma's breathing started to slow, started to approach something like normal. Her rational mind began asking questions her panic had suppressed. What had just happened? Why had they let her go? The woman in white had been real, solid, standing directly in her path, and then she was gone, vanished like smoke. Emma hadn't felt impact, hadn't seen her dive aside. One moment she was there, the next she wasn't, and that impossibility bothered Emma almost as much as the trap itself. She fumbled her phone from the cup holder, still no signal, and that seemed wrong too. This close to Carson City, she should have at least one bar, some tenuous connection to civilization. The phone's screen showed 0 bars, no network, as if she'd driven into some dead zone that shouldn't exist. The road curved ahead, and Emma took the turn too fast, tires squealing, the car fishtailing slightly before she regained control. She forced herself to slow down, forced herself to think. Crashing her car out here, alone, would accomplish what the woman in white and her accomplices had failed to do, would leave Emma vulnerable and stranded. She needed to reach Carson City, needed to reach people and light and the safety of numbers. The highway straightened out, and Emma saw something that made her foot instinctively move toward the brake. Red and blue lights flickered ahead, police lights, and her relief was so intense it felt physical, a release of tension that left her momentarily dizzy. A police car sat parked at an angle across the road, blocking one lane, its light bar painting the trees in alternating colors. An officer stood beside the vehicle, flashlight in hand, waving Emma to slow down, to stop. She obeyed, pulling over, coming to a complete stop, her hands shaking so badly she could barely put the car in park. The officer approached her window, flashlight beam sweeping across the interior of her car, and Emma fumbled with the window control, lowering it all the way this time, eager to speak, to report what had happened, to hand this nightmare over to someone with authority and weapons and backup. The officer's face came into view, weathered and tired, maybe 50 years old, with the kind of lines that came from years of night shifts and bad coffee. His uniform looked official. His badge caught the light from his own flashlight. Everything appeared legitimate. Emma opened her mouth to speak, words tumbling over themselves in their rush to escape. The officer held up one hand, stopping her, his expression shifting into something Emma couldn't quite read. Concern, pity, something else. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat professional tone of someone delivering bad news they delivered many times before, and Emma felt her relief curdle into something cold and sick. What he said next made her understand that she hadn't escaped at all, hadn't been released, had instead driven directly into the real trap while mistaking the obvious danger for the only danger. The road, the forest, the woman in white, all of it had been misdirection, had been designed to push her exactly where she'd ended up. The officer's words settled over Emma like a shroud, and she finally understood why the woman in white had been smiling, why the men had let her drive away, why they'd orchestrated such an elaborate performance. They hadn't needed to catch her because she'd never been running towards safety at all. The officer's words hung in the air between them, each syllable precisely chosen, delivered with the weight of someone who'd said them before and would say them again. Emma's mind refused to process their meaning at first, rejected them as nonsense, as impossible, but his expression left no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't a rescue. This was something else entirely, something that turned everything she thought she understood about the last 20 minutes inside out. The officer took a step back from her window, his flashlight lowering to point at the ground between them, and Emma noticed for the first time that his patrol car's engine wasn't running. The lights flashed in their rhythmic pattern, red and blue, but no sound came from the vehicle, no radio chatter, no idling engine, nothing but silence. Details she'd missed in her relief now crowded forward, demanding attention. The officer's uniform, while looking official from a distance, showed inconsistencies up close. Wrong shade of blue, wrong style of badge, wrong equipment on his belt. The gun holster sat empty, though he wore it like he was accustomed to its weight. His patrol car, while painted in the right colors, lacked the identifying numbers that should have been stenciled on its doors and hood. It was a costume, Emma realized with dawning horror. All of it was costume, theater, another layer of the trap she'd driven into, thinking she was escaping the first layer. The officer smiled, and it was the same smile the woman in white had worn, the same expression of predatory satisfaction. Emma's hand moved toward the gear shift, toward reverse, toward any motion that would get her away from this man and his fake authority. But he moved faster, his hand shooting through the window to grab her wrist. His grip was iron, his fingers digging into her tendons until her hand went numb and useless. He leaned in close enough that Emma could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath, and told her what would happen if she tried to run again. What would happen if she made this difficult? What would happen if she forced them to do this the hard way instead of the easy way? His voice never rose above conversational volume, never showed anger or frustration, maintained that same professional detachment as if he were explaining traffic law or the proper way to perform a sobriety test. Emma's free hand found the door handle, yanking it, but the child's safety lock engaged, trapping her inside. The officer's smile widened, appreciating her attempt, finding something amusing in her continued resistance, despite the obviousness of her situation. He released her wrist and stepped back, giving her room to think, to consider, to make the choice he was confident she would make. Behind his fake patrol car, headlights appeared, the black pickup truck from before, rolling to a stop 50 feet away, its driver still invisible behind the glare. Then more headlights, approaching from the direction Emma had come, and she recognized the silhouettes of the men who'd surrounded her car earlier, 4 of them crammed into a sedan that had seen better decades. They were converging, bringing all the pieces of their operation together, preparing for whatever came next. The woman in white emerged from the passenger side of the sedan, still barefoot, still wearing that torn dress, but now carrying something in her hands that Emma couldn't quite see. She walked with purpose toward Emma's trapped car, her smile visible even from this distance, growing wider with each step. The fake officer gestured toward the sedan, an invitation or a command, making clear Emma's options had narrowed to none. She could get out of her car voluntarily and walk, or she could stay inside and be extracted, but the outcome would be the same either way. Fighting would only determine how much pain preceded the inevitable. Emma's mind raced through scenarios, through possibilities, through desperate plans that fell apart under even casual scrutiny. She was outnumbered, surrounded, miles from help in either direction, with no phone signal and no witnesses. The rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive through 32 years of navigating an often hostile world, started doing grim calculations, started weighing survival odds against dignity, started considering what she might have to do or endure to see another sunrise. The woman in white reached Emma's car, stood beside the fake officer, her eyes meeting Emma's through the window glass. Whatever she held in her hands remained hidden, kept deliberately out of sight, another piece of theatre designed to let Emma's imagination do the heavy lifting. The worst fear was always the one you created yourself, fed with your own knowledge of human capability for cruelty, nourished by every true crime documentary and news report you'd consumed over a lifetime. The fake officer tapped on Emma's window, polite, patient, almost gentle, and made a rolling motion with his hand, indicating she should lower the glass again. Emma didn't move, didn't respond, her mind suddenly going very quiet and still. Sometimes, when faced with the complete absence of good options, the brain did something unexpected. It stopped panicking, stopped scrambling, and became preternaturally calm. Emma felt that calm descend over her now, felt herself slipping into a mode of consciousness she'd only experienced once before, years ago, when a boyfriend had gotten drunk and violent and she'd needed to think clearly despite her terror. Her hand moved to the window control, lowering the glass 3 inches, just enough to hear whatever the fake officer wanted to tell her. He leaned down, his face filling the gap, and Emma saw that his eyes were the same shade as her father's had been, brown and tired, and somehow sad despite the situation. He opened his mouth to speak, to give whatever instructions or explanations came next, and Emma's calm crystallized into decision. She didn't think about it, didn't debate or weigh consequences, simply acted on an instinct deeper than reason. Her hand shot through the narrow gap between the window glass and the doorframe, fingers extended, finding the fake officer's eyes and pressing inward with all the strength fear and adrenaline could provide. The fake officer's scream tore through the night, high and anguished. Nothing professional or controlled about it. Emma's fingers had found their target, had pressed into soft tissue that gave way beneath desperate pressure, and the man's hands went to his face, releasing her wrist, his flashlight clattering to the pavement. Emma didn't wait to see the result of her attack, didn't pause to process what she'd done. Her hand jerked back through the window gap, found the gear shift, slammed the car into drive. The accelerator hit the floor, tires spinning, the vehicle lurching forward toward the angled patrol car that blocked the road. The woman in white dove aside, graceful and fast, whatever she'd been holding falling from her hands, hitting the pavement with a metallic clatter. Emma didn't look, didn't want to know, kept her foot planted as her rental car struck the patrol car's rear quarter panel. Metal shrieked, glass shattered. Emma's airbag deployed with explosive force, slamming into her chest and face, momentarily blinding her. The rental car pushed through, momentum and desperation combining to shove the lighter patrol car aside just enough. Her front fender crumpled, her hood buckled, steam or smoke pouring from somewhere under the destroyed metal, but the engine still ran, still pulled, and Emma found herself on the other side of the roadblock, accelerating down the empty highway with tears and blood streaming down her face. The rearview mirror showed chaos behind her, the fake officer on his knees, hands still clutching his face, the woman in white standing frozen, the men from the sedan running toward their vehicle. They would follow, Emma knew. The pickup truck still ran, could catch her damaged car easily, could run her off the road, or just keep pace until her engine died from whatever damage the collision had caused. But she'd bought herself time, precious seconds, and she intended to spend them wisely. The speedometer climbed, despite the grinding noises coming from somewhere in the front end, despite the way the steering wheel pulled hard to the left, despite the dashboard lights that suddenly blazed to life in a Christmas display of warnings and failures. Emma fought the wheel, kept the car centered in the lane, kept moving forward because forward was the only direction that mattered, the only direction that led away from what she'd seen in the woman's hands when it fell. A syringe, she thought, or maybe a knife, something sharp and purposeful and meant to incapacitate or control. Her mind shied away from imagining the details, from following that thread to its logical conclusions. 1 mile passed, marked by a reflective sign that caught her damaged headlights, then 2. The rearview mirror showed headlights now, distant but gaining, the pursuit she'd expected. Emma's damaged car couldn't outrun them, couldn't maintain this speed much longer before something critical failed. The grinding noise grew louder, transformed into a rhythmic knocking that vibrated through the steering wheel, and Emma felt the vehicle losing power, acceleration dropping off, even though her foot remained planted. She needed a miracle, needed intervention, needed something to change the fundamental mathematics of her situation. The highway crested a hill, and Carson City spread out below her, a constellation of lights that meant people and safety and consequences for violence. Emma felt hope surge, brief and bright, before reality crushed it. The city was still miles away, too far for her dying vehicle to reach, too far for anyone down there to see or hear what happened up here in the darkness. The pursuing headlights grew closer. Close enough now that Emma could see they belonged to the pickup truck, its more powerful engine eating the distance between them. The driver had turned on his high beams, flooding Emma's mirrors with glare, making it impossible for her to see anything else, a tactic designed to blind and disorient. Her damaged car shuddered, the knocking noise reaching a crescendo, and then the engine died. Just quit. Mid-acceleration, all power cutting out simultaneously, leaving Emma coasting on momentum alone. The headlights died with the engine, plunging her into darkness broken only by the approaching high beams behind her. The steering wheel locked, power steering gone, making the car nearly impossible to control. Emma fought it anyway, used both hands and all her strength to aim the dying vehicle toward the shoulder, toward anywhere she could ditch it and run on foot. The pickup truck closed to within a few car lengths, near enough that Emma could see the driver's silhouette, larger than seemed possible, filling the cab. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to ram her or force her off the road, just following, patient, waiting for her vehicle to complete its failure. Emma's rental car rolled to a stop, momentum exhausted, sitting dead in the middle of the right lane. Her hands fumbled with the seatbelt release, fingers clumsy with panic, finally finding the button and pressing. The belt retracted, freeing her, and Emma grabbed the door handle, yanked it, remembering too late about the child safety lock the fake officer had engaged. She was trapped inside a metal box, unable to escape, while the pickup truck rolled to a stop behind her, its engine idling, high beams still blazing. The driver's door opened, and the silhouette resolved into a man, tall and broad, and moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew the outcome of this encounter before it began. Emma tried the door again, uselessly, then scrambled across the center console toward the passenger side, hoping that lock hadn't been engaged. Her hand found that handle, pulled, and the door opened. Blessed relief, escape suddenly possible again. She tumbled out onto the pavement, scraping her palms and knees, not caring, scrambling to her feet and running toward the trees that lined the road. Behind her, she heard boots on asphalt, heard the man's breathing, steady and unlabored, heard him call out something she didn't process, was afraid to process. The tree line was 20 feet away, then 10, and Emma's city shoes weren't designed for running, but she pushed them anyway, demanded they carry her into the forest where darkness might provide cover, where she might find a hiding place or a path or anything that wasn't this exposed highway. 5 feet from the trees, Emma's foot caught something, a pothole or crack, or just her own exhausted coordination failing, and she went down hard, chin bouncing off the pavement, stars exploding across her vision. She tasted blood, felt her consciousness waver, fought to stay alert. The boots stopped beside her head, and Emma looked up to see the man from the pickup truck standing over her, his face finally visible in the reflected glow of his own headlights. He wasn't what she expected. Wasn't cruel or savage or obviously dangerous. Just a man, maybe 40, with a weathered face and tired eyes, looking at Emma with something that might have been sympathy if you didn't know the context. He crouched down beside her, reached out one hand, and Emma flinched away, earned herself a sad smile in response. The man's hand hovered in the air between them, palm up, non-threatening, as if he were trying to coax a frightened animal. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the menace Emma had been bracing for, no satisfaction or cruelty, just a weary kind of resignation that somehow felt worse. He told Emma his name was Michael, told her he understood she was frightened, told her that everything that had happened tonight had been necessary, that she'd understand eventually, that struggling only made things harder. His words washed over Emma without penetration, her mind refusing to grant them meaning, refusing to normalize this situation by engaging with his casual tone. She tried to push herself up, to crawl toward the trees, but her arms wouldn't support her weight, shock and exhaustion finally catching up to adrenaline, draining her strength. Michael watched her attempt, made no move to stop her, just waited for her body to admit what her mind already knew. When she collapsed back to the pavement, arms giving out, he nodded, as if confirming something. Behind them, more headlights appeared, the sedan pulling up, disgorging its passengers. Emma heard footsteps, multiple sets, approaching from different angles, surrounding her position. She rolled onto her back, stared up at the sky, at stars that looked down with complete indifference. The woman in white's face appeared above her, upside down from Emma's perspective, still wearing that smile, asking Michael something Emma couldn't quite hear. His response was short, authoritative, settling whatever question had been raised. Emma felt hands on her arms, lifting, supporting her weight, walking her back toward the vehicles. She tried to resist, to fight, but her body wouldn't respond. Muscles turned to water, coordination destroyed by the crash and the fall, and the sustained terror. They positioned her against the side of the pickup truck, kept her upright while Michael retrieved something from the cab. When he returned, Emma saw he carried a first aid kit, mundane and incongruous, the kind you'd find in any responsible person's vehicle. He opened it, pulled out antiseptic wipes, began cleaning the scrapes on Emma's face and hands with surprising gentleness. The absurdity of the gesture, the disconnect between his actions and the situation, finally broke through Emma's shock. She laughed, high and slightly hysterical, earned concerned looks from the people holding her upright. Michael paused in his ministrations, met her eyes, and Emma saw genuine confusion there, as if he couldn't understand what she found funny. That confusion was its own revelation, pulled back a curtain Emma hadn't known existed. These people, whoever they were, whatever they intended, didn't see themselves as monsters. They'd constructed some narrative, some justification, that allowed them to perform these actions while maintaining some internal sense of righteousness or purpose. That realization was somehow more terrifying than simple sadism would have been. Michael finished cleaning her wounds, packed away the first aid kit with the same careful attention someone might show after treating a child's scraped knee. He told Emma they needed to move, that staying on the highway risked complications, that she'd be more comfortable somewhere else. The word comfortable landed with grotesque irony, but Emma's laugh had died, replaced by a numbness that felt like emotional armor, her psyche's last defense against complete breakdown. They guided her toward the sedan, the woman in white opening the rear door, gesturing for Emma to get inside. Emma's legs moved mechanically, muscle memory carrying her through motions her conscious mind had stopped directing. She folded herself into the back seat, smelling old cigarettes and air freshener, feeling the springs through worn upholstery. The woman in white slid in beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, while two of the men took the front seats. Michael returned to his pickup truck, The fake officer climbed into the patrol car despite his injured eyes, and the small convoy began moving, heading not toward Carson City's lights, but away from them, deeper into the forest, following roads that weren't marked on any map Emma had consulted. The woman in white hummed something under her breath, melody Emma almost recognized, something from childhood, a lullaby or nursery rhyme. Her hand found Emma's, squeezed it gently, offered comfort that made Emma's skin crawl. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, time losing coherence, marked only by the passage of trees beyond the window, endless and identical. Emma's mind drifted, shock finally granting the mercy of detachment, allowing her to observe without fully experiencing. She noticed the driver had a tattoo on his neck, noticed the passenger kept checking his phone despite the lack of signal, noticed the woman in white's humming never paused, never varied in tempo. The sedan turned onto a dirt road, unpaved, bouncing over ruts and stones, branches scraping the sides with sounds like fingernails on glass. They traveled this path for what felt like miles, civilization falling away completely, until the trees opened into a clearing dominated by a structure that Emma's exhausted brain initially couldn't categorize. Not a house, too large and institutional. Not a warehouse, too remote and purposeless. Something in between, something that had started as one thing and been converted to another. The architectural equivalent of Michael's fake uniform, wearing borrowed legitimacy to disguise its true function. The convoy stopped, engines cutting out one by one, leaving only the sound of wind in trees and the ticking of cooling metal. Doors opened, people emerged, and Emma was guided out of the sedan with that same careful gentleness that had characterized Michael's treatment of her injuries. Her feet touched gravel, and she looked up at the structure, at windows that showed light behind curtains, at a door that opened to reveal more people, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a younger man with a clipboard, both watching Emma's arrival with expressions of welcome that belonged at a bed and breakfast, not at the end of whatever nightmare she'd fallen into. The woman in white released Emma's hand, stepped back, her role apparently complete now that delivery had been accomplished. Michael appeared at Emma's other side, his hand on her elbow, not restraining but guiding, walking her toward the building's entrance. Emma's legs carried her forward, one foot in front of the other, because what else could they do? Where else could she go? The forest pressed in on all sides, miles from any road she knew, miles from anyone who might hear her scream. The older woman in the doorway smiled, warm and genuine, introduced herself as Margaret, welcomed Emma home. That word, home, landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward, disturbing everything. Emma opened her mouth to protest, to argue, to scream, but Margaret was already talking, already explaining, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who'd delivered this speech before, who knew exactly which words to use and which to avoid, who understood the delicate process of breaking someone's reality and rebuilding it into something new. Margaret's words flowed over Emma like water, gentle and inexorable, wearing down resistance through persistent kindness rather than force. She explained that Emma had been chosen, that her presence here wasn't random or malicious, but purposeful, that everything would make sense once Emma understood the full picture. The younger man with the clipboard, introduced as Daniel, stepped forward and began cataloguing Emma's belongings with business-like efficiency, removing her phone, her wallet, her keys, placing each item in a plastic bin while calling out descriptions for someone to record. Emma watched this process with detached fascination, as if it were happening to someone else, some other woman who'd made the mistake of driving through the forest at night. Margaret guided Emma inside, through a hallway that smelled of industrial cleaning products and something else, something organic and harder to identify. The walls were painted institutional beige, decorated with framed photographs of people Emma didn't recognize, smiling faces arranged in group shots that had the forced casualness of school pictures or corporate team-building events. They passed several closed doors, each numbered with brass plates, before Margaret stopped at number 7, produced a key from her pocket, and unlocked it. The room beyond was small but clean, furnished with a narrow bed, a dresser, a chair, positioned beside a window that showed only darkness and trees. A prison cell dressed up as a guest room, Emma thought. Or maybe a guest room stripped down to its essential function as a cage. Margaret showed Emma where the bathroom was, explained the schedule for meals and activities, mentioned something about orientation in the morning, all delivered in that same warm, grandmotherly tone that made the horror of the situation somehow worse. Emma stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking inventory. The window was barred, she noticed now, decorative metalwork on the outside that probably looked charming in daylight, but served an obvious secondary purpose. The door, while not reinforced, had a lock that worked from the outside. The bathroom held no mirrors, no glass, nothing that could be broken and weaponized. Every detail spoke of careful planning, of experience managing people who didn't want to be managed. Margaret asked if Emma needed anything, water or food or extra blankets, her concern apparently genuine, despite the absurdity of offering hospitality to a kidnapping victim. Emma finally found her voice, asked the only question that seemed to matter. Why? Why her? Why this? Why any of it? Margaret's expression softened into something that might have been pity, or might have been satisfaction at finally reaching the question she'd been waiting for. She settled into the chair, gestured for Emma to sit on the bed, and began explaining with the air of someone who'd waited a long time to share this particular story. The world, Margaret said, was broken in ways most people refused to acknowledge. Systems had failed, institutions had become corrupt or irrelevant. The social contract that held civilization together was dissolving. Margaret and her people, the ones who'd brought Emma here, saw themselves as solution architects, building something new from the pieces of what had failed. They needed people, specific people with specific qualities, to join their project, to become part of something larger than themselves. Emma had been observed, Margaret explained, assessed over a period of weeks without her knowledge. They'd watched how she treated service workers, how she responded to stress, how she navigated ethical dilemmas in her daily life. They determined she had the qualities they sought, the capacity for adaptation and resilience, the potential to understand what they were building once she got past her initial resistance. The trap on the highway, the woman in white. All of it had been a test, Margaret said, a way to see how Emma responded under pressure, to confirm what their earlier observation had suggested. Emma had passed, had shown the kind of quick thinking and survival instinct they valued. The violence she'd shown the fake officer, far from disqualifying her, had actually been the final confirmation they'd needed. Emma listened to this explanation with growing disbelief, waiting for some detail that would make it make sense, some revelation that would transform Margaret's words from insane to merely terrible. But the revelation never came, just more justifications, more careful explanations of methodology and purpose that somehow never quite explained what the actual purpose was. Margaret spoke about community and shared goals and the necessity of difficult transitions, but beneath the corporate language lurked something cultish and dangerous, belief systems that had calcified into certainty, unable to accommodate doubt or dissent. When Margaret finally finished, when her explanation reached its natural conclusion, she asked Emma if she understood. Emma, exhausted beyond measure, answered honestly that she didn't, couldn't, wouldn't. Margaret nodded, as if expecting this response, told Emma that understanding would come with time, that resistance was natural and even healthy, that tomorrow would bring opportunities to learn more. She stood, moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the knob to deliver one final piece of information. Emma's car, her damaged rental, had been removed from the highway along with the fake patrol car. The scene had been cleaned, evidence eliminated. As far as the world knew, Emma had simply disappeared somewhere between Millbrook and Carson City, another person who'd driven into the forest and never emerged. Her rental company would file a report eventually, police would make cursory efforts to locate her, but this stretch of highway had swallowed people before, would swallow people again. The forest kept its secrets, Margaret said, and so did they. She left, the lock clicking into place with finality, footsteps receding down the hallway. Emma sat on the bed, staring at the barred window, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. She'd survived the trap on the highway, only to discover it had been the mouth of a larger trap, one she couldn't see the boundaries of yet, couldn't understand the true shape of. Margaret's explanation had raised more questions than it answered, left Emma with the terrible certainty that whatever she'd stumbled into was far more complex and dangerous than a simple kidnapping. These people believed in something, believed enough to dedicate resources and planning to it, believed enough to justify actions that from any normal perspective were clearly crimes. That belief, that certainty, was its own form of danger, more threatening in some ways than simple violence would have been. The night passed in fragments of consciousness, Emma drifting between wakefulness and something that wasn't quite sleep, her body demanding rest while her mind refused to surrender to vulnerability. Every sound in the building seemed amplified, footsteps in distant hallways, doors opening and closing, voices too muted to understand, but present enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Once, maybe around 3 in the morning, if her internal clock could still be trusted, she heard someone screaming, raw and primal, the sound cutting off abruptly in a way that suggested intervention rather than natural conclusion. Emma sat up in the darkness, heart hammering, waiting for the scream to resume or for some explanation to present itself. Neither came, just renewed silence and the weight of her own imagination filling in terrible possibilities. When grey light finally began seeping through the barred window, Emma was sitting in the chair, watching the forest become visible tree by tree as dawn crept across it. She'd spent hours thinking, analysing, trying to construct a plan from the limited information she possessed. The building held other people, other prisoners or victims or whatever Margaret's sanitised language wanted to call them. That scream had been human and terrified, which meant Emma wasn't unique in her resistance, wasn't the only person here who understood this situation for what it actually was. The lock clicked, startling Emma despite her anticipation of someone eventually coming. The door opened to reveal not Margaret, but a younger woman, maybe 30, wearing jeans and a sweater that would have looked at home in any coffee shop or bookstore. She carried a tray with breakfast, oatmeal and fruit and orange juice, placing it on the dresser with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine task. Her name was Sarah, she explained, and she'd been where Emma was now, had gone through the same confusion and fear and eventual understanding. She spoke about her transition with the slightly glazed enthusiasm of a convert, describing how Margaret and the others had opened her eyes to truths she'd been blind to, how the project they were building would change everything once it reached critical mass. Emma asked what the project actually was, what they were building, and Sarah's answer was maddeningly vague, circular definitions that referenced shared purpose and collective awakening without ever naming concrete objectives. When Emma pressed harder, demanded specifics, Sarah's enthusiasm faltered, replaced by something that looked like uncertainty or maybe fear. She'd been given instructions, she admitted, told what to say and how to say it, and deviating from the script apparently caused distress. Emma recognized the signs, had seen documentaries about cults and deprogramming, understood she was looking at someone whose reality had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to someone else's specifications. Sarah finished her prepared speech, reminded Emma that orientation would begin after breakfast, and left with the same locked-door finality Margaret had employed. Emma forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need strength, need fuel for whatever came next. The oatmeal was perfectly prepared, the fruit fresh, orange juice cold and sweet. They were taking care of her physical needs with the same attention they'd shown when Michael cleaned her wounds, maintaining her value as an asset even while stripping away her autonomy. Orientation, when it finally came, took the form of Daniel with his clipboard, arriving to escort Emma through the building to what he called the community room. They passed more numbered doors, more photographs of smiling people who'd supposedly found purpose here, through hallways that branched and intersected in ways designed to confuse anyone trying to memorize the layout. The community room was larger than Emma expected, easily 30 feet on a side, furnished with couches and chairs arranged in conversational clusters. Walls painted a cheerful yellow that belonged in an elementary school. A dozen people occupied the space, some reading, some engaged in quiet conversation, all turning to watch Emma's arrival with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy to something that might have been warning. Margaret presided over the room from a large armchair, positioned to observe all corners, her welcoming smile firmly in place as she gestured Emma toward an empty seat near the center. This, Margaret explained, was where community members spent their time between activities, where they learned to know each other, where bonds formed that would sustain them through difficult transitions. She spoke about the importance of connection, about humans as social creatures who needed belonging to thrive, and Emma recognized the manipulation even as she felt its pull. These people, these other captives, represented potential allies or information sources, and getting to know them meant playing along with Margaret's community theatre at least temporarily. A man in his 40s, introduced as Thomas, asked Emma where she was from, what she did for work, normal getting-to-know-you questions delivered with such studied casualness that Emma knew they'd been coached, knew this whole interaction was staged for her benefit. She answered briefly, offering minimal information, watching the others for signs of who might still be resisting, who might be potential allies in whatever escape attempt she'd eventually attempt. Most showed the same glazed enthusiasm Sarah had displayed, converts who'd accepted or submitted to whatever process Margaret employed. But a few, Emma noticed, maintained a wariness in their eyes, a careful distance between their words and their expressions. One woman in particular, maybe 50, with grey streaking her dark hair, met Emma's gaze directly and held it for a moment longer than comfortable. And Emma read volumes in that look, a recognition of shared reality, shared resistance. Margaret controlled the conversation with subtle skill, redirecting when topics threatened to become too personal or specific, maintaining the cheerful superficiality that prevented real connection or conspiracy. She explained that Emma's first few days would focus on adjustment, on learning the community's rhythms and expectations, on beginning to understand the philosophy that guided their work. There would be study sessions, Margaret said, opportunities to engage with texts and ideas that challenged conventional thinking, that opened minds to possibilities the mainstream dismissed or suppressed. Emma recognized the language of radicalization, the same patterns employed by extremist groups across the political spectrum, the gradual process of isolating people from external perspectives while feeding them increasingly reality-detached narratives. But recognizing the pattern didn't mean she could resist it, not while locked in this building, surrounded by people who'd either genuinely converted or learned to fake it convincingly enough to survive. The orientation continued for hours, Margaret cycling through topics that ranged from meal schedules to behavioral expectations to the consequences of attempting to leave without permission. That last topic she delivered with the same warm smile she'd maintained throughout, but her words carried an edge that cut through the grandmother act, made clear that violence remained an option despite the careful kindness she'd shown so far. People who tried to run, Margaret explained, endangered not just themselves, but the entire community, forced interventions that benefited no one, delayed their own progress toward understanding. Better, she suggested, to embrace the process, to trust that those who'd been here longer knew things Emma didn't yet, that time would reveal what resistance currently obscured. Emma endured the orientation, nodded when expected to nod, answered questions with carefully neutral responses, maintained a mask of cooperation while her mind catalogued details and mapped possibilities. She noticed the windows in the community room. Like those in her bedroom, all featured decorative bars. She counted doors and tried to determine which might lead outside versus deeper into the building. She observed the other community members, paying special attention to the grey-haired woman who'd met her eyes earlier, noting that Margaret called her Patricia and seemed to watch her more closely than the others. When orientation finally concluded, when Margaret declared Emma had done well for her first day and could have some time to rest before dinner, Daniel escorted her back through the maze of hallways to room 7. The walk provided opportunities to memorize landmarks, to note that some hallways had exterior windows while others didn't, to observe that certain areas of the building seemed older or more institutional than others, suggesting multiple construction phases or purposes. Daniel maintained silence during the journey, his clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield, and Emma wondered what his story was, how he'd ended up here, whether he'd started as a prisoner and graduated to staff, or had been recruited through some other means. Back in her room, door locked behind her, Emma finally allowed herself to stop performing cooperation. She moved to the window, examining the bars more closely, testing their strength, finding them solidly mounted into concrete. The glass itself was thick, possibly reinforced, not something that could be broken quietly or easily. She checked the bathroom, looking for any overlooked tools or weaknesses, finding only the same careful attention to security she'd noted before. The room offered no obvious escape route, had been designed by people who understood desperate creativity, who'd anticipated and countered the obvious attempts. Emma sat on the bed, forcing herself to think strategically rather than frantically. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, would only cloud her judgment and waste energy. She needed information, needed to understand the full scope of this place, needed to identify allies and opportunities. Patricia seemed like the most promising contact, assuming Emma had read that look correctly, assuming it hadn't been wishful thinking imposing meaning on a meaningless moment. The challenge would be finding opportunities to speak with her privately, away from Margaret's observation, in a building designed to prevent exactly that kind of unsupervised interaction. Hours passed, marked by the changing angle of light through the window, by the sounds of activity elsewhere in the building, by Emma's own thoughts circling and circling without finding purchase. Dinner arrived via Sarah again. The same scripted enthusiasm, the same vague answers to direct questions. Emma ate mechanically, maintaining the cooperation mask, while Sarah chatted about evening activities and community bonding and the growth she'd personally experienced since arriving. When Sarah mentioned that new members typically participated in one-on-one sessions with Margaret during their first week, something in Emma's stomach dropped. One-on-one meant isolation, meant Margaret's full attention and skills focused on breaking down resistance without witnesses or interruptions. That was probably where the real conversion happened, Emma realized, where whatever combination of manipulation and coercion these people employed got applied with concentrated force. The group activities were just softening, preparing victims for the main event. Sarah left, taking the dinner tray, and Emma was alone again with her thoughts and the approaching darkness beyond the barred window. She found herself thinking about her apartment in San Diego, about the job she'd been traveling for, about the people who'd notice her absence eventually. Would they look for her? Would anyone connect her disappearance to this stretch of highway? Margaret had seemed confident that the answer was no, that Emma had effectively vanished from the world, become one more unsolved mystery in a country full of them. The night brought sounds again, different ones this time, voices raised in what might have been argument or celebration, impossible to tell through walls and distance. Music played somewhere, something acoustic and melancholy, bleeding through the building's structure. Emma found herself listening to these sounds like they were clues, trying to construct an understanding of the community's social dynamics, its rhythms and tensions. Then, maybe around 10 o'clock, a sound much closer. A soft scratching at her door, barely audible, deliberate. Emma approached cautiously, putting her ear against the wood, listening. The scratching repeated, followed by a whisper so quiet Emma almost missed it. A voice, female, saying just 2 words through the gap between door and frame. Patricia's voice, Emma realized, recognizing the timbre from the community room. The 2 words were simple, delivered with compressed urgency, a message that had to be brief to avoid detection. They offered no explanation, no context, just a fragment of information that rearranged everything Emma thought she understood about her situation. Patricia said those 2 words, and then footsteps retreated quickly, disappearing down the hallway, leaving Emma alone with a truth that transformed her understanding of this place from terrifying to something exponentially worse. Patricia's words echoed in Emma's mind, 2 syllables that served as both warning and revelation. Not prisoners. Emma pressed her forehead against the door, processing implications, reconstructing her understanding of the community room dynamics through this new lens. The glazed enthusiasm she'd interpreted as coercion or Stockholm Syndrome took on different meaning now. Suggested that at least some of these people had chosen to be here, believed genuinely in whatever Margaret was selling. That made them more dangerous, not less. Meant they'd actively participate in whatever process was designed to transform Emma from captive to convert. She'd been categorizing everyone as fellow victims, potential allies in resistance or escape. But Patricia's message suggested a more complicated truth. Some were victims, maybe, but others were believers, missionaries working to expand their ranks. The question became determining which was which, identifying who could be trusted versus who would report any deviation from expected cooperation. Emma spent the next few hours sitting in darkness, room lights off to discourage any check-ins, thinking through what she knew and what she could reasonably infer. Margaret ran some kind of intentional community, probably qualifying as a cult by any meaningful definition, that recruited through kidnapping rather than voluntary conversion. They targeted specific people, conducted surveillance, employed elaborate traps to acquire new members. Once here, victims underwent some process designed to break down external identities and rebuild them around the community's shared beliefs. Some resisted, like Patricia apparently was, while others accepted or embraced the transformation. The building itself served as both housing and prison, providing comfort while eliminating freedom, constructing an environment where leaving became psychologically difficult, even if physically possible. What Emma couldn't determine yet was the community's actual purpose beyond self-perpetuation. Margaret had spoken about broken systems and building something new, but those were abstractions that could cover anything from survivalist militia to religious extremism to political radicalization. The specifics mattered, would help Emma understand what arguments to expect, what vulnerabilities to exploit, what consequences to anticipate if escape attempts failed. Sleep came eventually, exhaustion overriding anxiety, pulling Emma into dreams that mixed memory and fear into nonsense narratives. She woke several times, disoriented, needing moments to remember where she was and why. Each time, the locked door and barred window reasserted reality, pushed her back into wakefulness that felt barely different from the dreams. Morning arrived with Sarah's return, breakfast tray and scripted cheerfulness. Announcement that Emma's first one-on-one session with Margaret was scheduled for after the meal. Sarah delivered this information like it was a privilege, an opportunity Emma should be grateful for, and Emma forced herself to respond with the appropriate enthusiasm, to maintain the cooperation mask even though dread coiled in her stomach. The session took place in what Margaret called her office, a room that felt more like a therapist's consultation space than anything administrative. furnished with comfortable chairs and soft lighting and decorative touches designed to project trustworthiness. Margaret sat in one of the chairs, gestured Emma toward its twin, and began what was clearly a well-practiced script. She asked about Emma's childhood, her family relationships, her career satisfaction, her romantic history, her deepest fears and greatest disappointments. The questions came wrapped in concern, in the kind of active listening techniques that made you want to open up, want to share, want to be understood by this grandmother figure who seemed so genuinely interested. Emma recognized the manipulation, had taken enough psychology courses to understand the basics of what Margaret was attempting. But recognition didn't make the technique ineffective. There was something seductive about having someone's complete attention, having your story heard without judgment or interruption, having your struggles validated and your pain acknowledged. Margaret was skilled at this, had clearly done it hundreds of times, knew exactly where to press and where to hold back, knew how to construct the illusion of safety in a situation that was anything but. Emma answered questions carefully, offering truth mixed with strategic omissions, trying to seem cooperative without providing ammunition that could be used against her later. She spoke about her parents' divorce, about job stress, about dating disappointments, about feeling disconnected from meaningful purpose, all things that were true but not complete truths, surface realities that protected deeper vulnerabilities. Margaret absorbed it all, nodding and making small, encouraging sounds, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she was genuinely processing rather than just waiting to talk. After maybe an hour of this, Margaret shifted gears, began talking about the community itself, about the philosophy that guided their work. She spoke about consciousness and awakening, about most people sleepwalking through life following scripts written by systems that didn't serve human flourishing. She talked about breaking free from conditioning, about recovering authentic selfhood beneath layers of socialization, about the possibility of genuine community built on shared truth rather than convenient lies. The language was intoxicating, touched on real problems with real insights, and Emma found herself having to consciously resist its pull. Margaret wasn't wrong about everything. That was the danger. Systems were broken, people were alienated. Modern life did feel disconnected from deeper meaning for many. Where Margaret went wrong was in her solution, in the assumption that kidnapping and forced conversion represented valid responses to legitimate problems. But she was smart enough not to mention those elements, focused instead on the appealing vision of what the community could be, painting pictures of belonging and purpose that touched something hungry in Emma's psyche. When the session finally ended, when Margaret smiled and said they'd made excellent progress and would continue tomorrow, Emma felt disoriented and exhausted, as if she'd run a marathon while standing still. Margaret had gotten inside her head, had found tender spots and pressed on them, had made Emma question assumptions she'd taken for granted. That was the point, Emma understood. That was the beginning of the breaking down process. Make someone doubt their own perceptions, their own judgments, create uncertainty about what they knew to be true. Once doubt was established, new certainties could be offered, new frameworks that seemed like insights rather than impositions. Daniel escorted Emma back to the community room rather than her bedroom, explaining that afternoon time was for socialization and recreational activities. The same dozen people occupied the space, arranged differently now. Some playing board games, others engaged in what looked like crafts projects. Margaret absent, but her influence present in how carefully structured and supervised everything felt. Emma took a seat near Patricia, not directly adjacent, but close enough for conversation if opportunities arose, and accepted a book someone offered her. Something philosophical about consciousness and reality that Emma suspected was required reading for community members. She pretended to read while actually watching the room's dynamics, noting who spoke to whom, who seemed comfortable versus performing comfort, who watched the doors, and who seemed to have forgotten they were locked. Patricia worked on needlepoint, something intricate and time-consuming. her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her eyes remained alert, scanning the room periodically. When one of the true believers, a young man named Jason, who'd spoken enthusiastically during orientation, moved to the far corner to help someone with a jigsaw puzzle, Patricia leaned slightly toward Emma without looking at her directly. Her lips barely moved, voice pitched low enough that it could have been mistaken for reading aloud to herself, and she delivered information in compressed fragments, knowing interruption could come at any moment. 3 of them still resisted, Patricia whispered. Herself, Emma, and a man named Robert, who pretended conversion to reduce surveillance. The others were genuine believers or broken enough to fake it convincingly. Margaret's one-on-one sessions were the key battleground, where most people lost their ability to resist, where the real conversion happened. Patricia had maintained resistance by appearing to make slow progress, giving Margaret small victories to sustain hope, while never actually surrendering core identity. It worked, but barely, required constant vigilance and performance. Emma absorbed this information without responding, without giving any indication she'd heard, just kept her eyes on her book and turned a page at an appropriate interval. Patricia continued, explaining that escape was theoretically possible, but practically difficult. The building's exits were locked and alarmed, grounds were monitored, the forest offered no clear path to safety. 2 people had tried to run in Patricia's time here. Both were brought back. Both were subjected to consequences she wouldn't describe, but that had broken them completely. The better strategy, Patricia suggested, was patience, was waiting for opportunities, was gathering information and building capability, rather than attempting desperate action. She stopped talking as suddenly as she'd started, attention returning fully to her needlepoint, as Sarah entered the community room with an announcement about evening activities. Movie night, Sarah explained with that standard enthusiasm, a chance to watch something together as community, to share experience and discussion. Emma felt her heart sink at the prospect of more manufactured togetherness. More carefully curated content designed to reinforce whatever messages Margaret wanted reinforced. But she maintained the cooperation mask, nodded agreement, allowed herself to be herded with the others toward a different room that held a large television and rows of chairs arranged theater-style. The movie, when it started, surprised Emma by being a mainstream documentary about social isolation and mental health, not some heavy-handed propaganda piece. She watched it warily, waiting for the manipulation, finding it instead in the discussion afterward. Margaret materialized to facilitate, asking questions designed to connect the documentary's themes to the community's philosophy, drawing out testimonials from converted members about how being here had solved problems the documentary described. Jason spoke at length about how empty his life had been before, how the community had given him purpose and connection he'd never found in the outside world. Sarah shared a similar narrative, as did several others, each story following a template that was probably too consistent to be entirely organic. But the emotion behind the words seemed genuine. At least for some of them, suggested these people truly believed they'd found something valuable here, truly saw themselves as rescued rather than captured. Emma recognized this as another level of the trap. It wasn't enough to physically imprison people. Margaret wanted to make them grateful for their imprisonment, wanted them to defend their chains as choices. When Margaret's attention turned to Emma, asking for her thoughts on the documentary and whether anything resonated with her own experience, Emma knew she was being tested. Too much enthusiasm would be transparent, too much resistance would mark her as problematic, needing additional intervention. She threaded the needle, acknowledged that modern life often felt isolating, admitted that finding meaningful connection was challenging, expressed cautious interest in understanding the community's approach. Margaret's smile suggested Emma had passed this particular test, had shown willingness to engage, if not yet agree. The evening concluded with what Margaret called gratitude practice, each person sharing something they were thankful for, another exercise that mixed legitimate therapeutic technique with cultish manipulation. Emma listened to people express gratitude for the community, for Margaret's guidance, for the opportunity to grow and change, each statement reinforcing the narrative of this place as refuge rather than prison. When her turn came, Emma expressed gratitude for safety, for food and shelter, for not being alone, all things that were technically true and strategically ambiguous enough to satisfy without compromising her internal resistance. Back in room 7, door locked, Emma lay in darkness and took inventory of what she'd learned. Patricia's warning and subsequent information had clarified the landscape, helped Emma understand what she was actually facing. Margaret ran a sophisticated operation, had refined her methods over time, knew how to break people psychologically and rebuild them according to her specifications. The community contained genuine believers who'd defend the system even if given opportunities to leave, making them unreliable as allies. Escape was possible but difficult, required planning and patience rather than desperate action. The one-on-one sessions were the primary threat, where Margaret would focus her skills on dismantling Emma's resistance piece by piece. Emma needed a strategy, needed to determine how to navigate the coming days and weeks without either being converted or provoking whatever consequences Patricia had alluded to. The approach that made most sense was Patricia's own method, apparent cooperation with strategic resistance, giving Margaret the appearance of progress while maintaining core identity. But Emma also needed to work toward actual escape, needed to gather information and identify opportunities, needed to find whatever weakness in the security existed and exploit it. She thought about the building's layout, about the hallways she'd been escorted through, trying to construct a mental map. Some areas had exterior windows, suggesting ground level or at least lower floors. Some hallways had the worn flooring and dated fixtures of older construction. If the building had been repurposed from something else, there might be architectural features Margaret hadn't fully secured, access points intended for different uses that could become escape routes. Emma needed to see more of the building, needed reasons to move through spaces beyond the handful she'd been shown. The challenge was creating those opportunities without arousing suspicion, without making her curiosity obvious. The next morning brought another breakfast from Sarah. Another one-on-one session with Margaret, another opportunity for psychological warfare disguised as therapy. Margaret picked up where she'd left off, probing deeper into Emma's relationships and disappointments, constructing a narrative about Emma's life that emphasized isolation and unfulfilled potential. She spoke about the gap between who Emma was and who Emma could become, about the limitations imposed by conventional thinking, about the possibilities that opened up when someone allowed themselves to question everything. The technique was effective, Emma had to admit, touched on real insecurities and magnified them, made her life outside this place seem smaller and less meaningful than it actually was. Emma caught herself agreeing with observations she should have challenged, found herself sharing vulnerabilities she'd intended to protect, realized Margaret was skilled enough to bypass her conscious defenses and connect directly with deeper needs. The session left Emma shaken, uncertain about her ability to maintain resistance over time, worried that Margaret would eventually succeed in breaking her down regardless of what strategies Emma employed. That afternoon, in the community room, she positioned herself near Patricia again, hoping for more information or guidance. Patricia seemed to sense Emma's distress, offered another fragment of whispered advice during a moment when attention was elsewhere. The key, Patricia said, was maintaining a private self, separate from the performed self, keeping an internal identity that Margaret couldn't access or alter. Think of it as method acting, Patricia suggested, playing a role convincingly while remembering it's a role, maintaining the boundary between performance and reality. Emma wasn't sure she possessed those skills, Wasn't sure she could sustain that kind of deliberate dissociation, but she understood the strategy and committed to attempting it. Over the following days, Emma settled into the community's rhythms, learned its patterns and expectations, began identifying opportunities for information gathering. She discovered that certain times of day saw reduced supervision, that Margaret couldn't be everywhere simultaneously, that the true believers who'd been given trust and privilege sometimes became careless about security. She learned which areas of the building were residential, which were functional, which seemed to serve purposes she couldn't determine. She mapped emergency exits in her mind, noted which windows had bars and which didn't, observed that the building's perimeter was monitored by cameras, but not as densely as she'd initially feared. She noticed that Thursday afternoons involved what Margaret called work therapy, community members maintaining the building and grounds, providing opportunities to access areas normally restricted. Emma volunteered eagerly for these assignments, performing her cooperation so convincingly that Sarah commented on her positive attitude, on how quickly she was adapting. During one work session, assigned to clean windows in an administrative corridor, Emma discovered an office that had been converted into storage, packed with boxes of documents and supplies. She glimpsed letterhead during a moment when her supervisor's attention was elsewhere, saw the building's previous identity confirmed in faded text. Riverbend Psychiatric Hospital, closed 15 years earlier during budget cuts, sold to private buyers whose names weren't listed. Margaret had acquired a defunct mental institution, Emma realized, had inherited architecture designed for controlling people who didn't want to be controlled, had simply repurposed existing infrastructure for her own ends. The discovery provided context but not comfort, suggested Margaret had chosen this location deliberately, had recognized its utility for her purposes. Another work session took Emma outside for the first time since her arrival. Assigned to a small gardening crew maintaining flower beds near the building's entrance. She memorized everything: the distance to the tree line, the absence of fencing despite the surveillance cameras, the dirt road leading away into forest that probably eventually connected to paved roads and civilization. The work supervisor, a true believer named Marcus, chatted cheerfully about the community's self-sufficiency goals, while Emma calculated running distances and survival odds. Escape from the building itself seemed achievable during these outdoor sessions, but escape from the forest, from hunters who knew the terrain and had vehicles, seemed far less certain. She needed more than opportunity, needed advantage, needed something that would give her enough head start to reach help before being recaptured. The one-on-one sessions with Margaret continued, twice weekly, each one chipping away at Emma's resistance through accumulated psychological pressure. Margaret was patient, seemed content to make incremental progress, celebrated small admissions or agreements as victories while continuing to press for more. She'd shifted tactics, Emma noticed, had moved from exploration to argument, now actively challenging Emma's worldview with philosophical positions that sounded sophisticated and were genuinely difficult to counter without preparation. Margaret spoke about the social construction of reality, about how everything Emma took as natural or inevitable was actually contingent and changeable. She questioned concepts like individualism and autonomy, suggested they were illusions that served power structures rather than human flourishing. She painted visions of alternative social arrangements based on collective consciousness and shared purpose, making them sound reasonable and even appealing. Emma found herself having to consciously resist, having to remind herself that these ideas, however intellectually interesting they might be in an academic context, were being deployed in service of justifying kidnapping and forced conversion. But the cumulative effect was exhausting, required constant vigilance, made Emma understand how people broke under sustained ideological pressure. By the third week, Emma had established enough apparent cooperation that restrictions loosened slightly. She was permitted to move between her room and the community room without escort during designated hours, was trusted to participate in activities without constant supervision, was integrated into the community's social fabric to a degree that suggested Margaret saw progress in her conversion. Emma exploited this trust carefully, used unsupervised moments to explore further, to map the building more completely, to identify security weaknesses that might become opportunities. She discovered that the building's east wing was largely unused, converted storage and administrative spaces that saw minimal traffic. She found a ground-floor window in a former therapy room that, while locked, wasn't barred and seemed less robust than others. She noted that cameras had blind spots, that certain areas went unmonitored during shift changes, that the true believers who'd been given security responsibilities sometimes became complacent. She shared these findings with Patricia during whispered exchanges, collaborated on escape planning despite the enormous risks involved. Patricia had been here for 8 months, had maintained resistance longer than anyone else, and her continued presence suggested both extraordinary strength and the fundamental difficulty of escape. She cautioned Emma against premature action, against letting hope override judgment, told stories of previous escape attempts that had failed despite careful planning. But she also shared information about the forest, about directions that led to roads versus deeper wilderness, about the approximate distance to the nearest town. She mentioned that supplies were delivered every 2 weeks, that the delivery truck represented potential opportunity if someone could hide in or on it, if someone could survive the drive without being discovered. The next delivery day was 10 days away, Patricia said, which gave them time to prepare, to position supplies and create opportunity. Emma committed to the plan despite recognizing its flaws, despite knowing that even success might only mean dying lost in the forest rather than trapped in this building. The alternative was continuing to endure Margaret's sessions, continuing to feel her sense of self eroding under sustained psychological assault, continuing to watch the horizon of her former life recede further each day. She'd been gone for 3 weeks now, was surely classified as missing, but she had no faith that anyone would find her here, would connect her disappearance to this remote location. Margaret was right about that much. The forest kept its secrets, and Emma was becoming one of them, whether she resisted or not. The days before the scheduled delivery crawled past with agonizing slowness, each one bringing more sessions with Margaret, more opportunities for Emma's cover to slip, more chances for someone to notice the desperation beneath her performance. She maintained the cooperation mask through sheer willpower, gave Margaret apparent breakthroughs in understanding that were really just calculated concessions, played the role Patricia had described of someone making progress toward conversion. Margaret seemed pleased with Emma's trajectory, commented on how much more open she'd become, how the defensive barriers were lowering, how Emma was beginning to see beyond her conditioning. The praise felt like acid, burned Emma's sense of self, even as she smiled and thanked Margaret for her guidance. On the 5th day before delivery, something shifted in the community's dynamics. 2 new people arrived, brought in with the same careful manipulation Emma had experienced, a man and a woman in their 20s who looked shell-shocked and terrified. Emma watched their intake process with new understanding, saw how Sarah and the other believers immediately surrounded them with manufactured warmth, how Margaret positioned herself as savior rather than captor, how the entire community performed rescue rather than imprisonment. The new arrivals were assigned rooms, given orientations, integrated into the daily routine, and Emma wondered how many people this building held total, how many rooms were occupied versus empty, how large Margaret's operation actually was. She'd counted 14 people in the community room consistently, but the building could easily hold twice that number, might contain people she'd never seen or been permitted to interact with. The thought added new urgency to her escape planning, suggested that whatever was happening here operated on a larger scale than she'd initially understood. Patricia seemed equally disturbed by the new arrivals, whispered during their next exchange that recruitment was accelerating, that Margaret was expanding operations, that time was becoming more critical. They finalized plans for the delivery day, agreed on timing and roles, committed to attempting escape despite odds that seemed to worsen with each passing hour. Emma volunteered for outdoor work duty on the scheduled delivery day, established a pattern of enthusiasm for these assignments that would make her presence expected rather than suspicious. She cached supplies during unsupervised moments, a bottle of water hidden behind bushes, a jacket stashed in a garden shed, small preparations that might mean the difference between success and failure. The night before delivery day, Emma couldn't sleep, lay in darkness, running through scenarios and contingencies, trying to anticipate everything that could go wrong. The plan was straightforward. During the confusion of unloading supplies, while attention was focused on the truck and inventory, Emma would slip into the forest and run. Patricia would create a distraction if needed, would buy Emma minutes of head start by drawing attention elsewhere. Once in the trees, Emma would move east toward the dirt road she'd glimpsed during work sessions, would follow it to pavement and civilization or die trying. The simplicity of the plan was both strength and weakness, left little room for adaptation, but also minimized opportunities for failure. When morning came, Emma performed her routine with mechanical precision, ate breakfast without tasting it, participated in morning activities without really being present. Her mind was already in the forest, already running, already fighting for the freedom she'd been systematically denied. The delivery truck arrived at 2 in the afternoon, right on schedule. A nondescript white panel van that might have been delivering to any rural institution. Marcus supervised the unloading process, directing community members in moving boxes from truck to storage areas, while Emma positioned herself near the building's corner, close to her cache supplies, ready to move. The driver remained in the cab, never fully visible, probably instructed not to interact with the community members, not to see too much or ask questions that might make him complicit. Emma watched Marcus check items against a manifest, watched Sarah and Jason carry boxes inside, watched Patricia move into position near the main entrance where she could create the promised distraction. The moment came unexpectedly, sooner than planned, when Marcus stepped inside to verify storage locations, when the driver's attention focused on his phone, when a brief window of opportunity opened. Patricia dropped the box she was carrying, let it spill its contents across the ground, called out in apparent distress that she'd hurt her ankle. Sarah and Jason moved to help her, attention diverted, and Emma ran. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just sprinted for the tree line with everything her body could give. Behind her she heard shouting, heard her name called, heard the organized response beginning. But she'd reached the trees, crashed into undergrowth, kept moving east by dead reckoning and desperation. Branches tore at her face and arms, roots tried to trip her, but she maintained forward momentum, counting seconds in her head, trying to estimate distance. 1 minute passed, then 2, and she hadn't heard pursuit yet, hadn't heard vehicles starting or dogs barking. Maybe she'd actually achieved surprise. Maybe they hadn't been prepared for this. Maybe she'd get the head start she needed. Then she heard engines, heard voices coordinating, heard the hunt beginning in earnest. Emma adjusted her trajectory, angling more directly east, pushing through pain and exhaustion, demanding her body continue beyond what felt possible. The forest was dense, offered concealment, but impeded movement, made progress frustratingly slow. She grabbed her hidden jacket from the garden shed as she passed it, pulled it on against the afternoon chill, kept moving. 5 minutes, maybe 10, impossible to track time accurately while running, while terrified, while every breath burned and every muscle screamed. The ground began sloping downward, water sound somewhere ahead, probably a creek that might or might not be crossable. Emma adjusted course toward the water, gambling that crossing it would make her harder to track, would buy additional time. The creek appeared suddenly, a narrow stream cutting through the forest, banks muddy and steep. Emma plunged down into it, gasoline water shocking cold, soaking her legs to mid-thigh. She turned downstream, using the water to hide her tracks, trying to remember survival advice about evading pursuit. Move downhill. Downhill led to larger water sources. Water sources led to civilization. The creek widened, deepened, forced Emma to wade rather than run, slowing her progress frustratingly. Behind her, maybe quarter-mile back, she heard vehicles on the dirt road she'd been trying to reach, heard them stopping, heard voices. They'd figured out her direction, were positioning to cut her off, were using their knowledge of terrain to counter her head start.